Okay, good morning, everybody. I am going to call to order the Policy and Innovation Committee meeting for the Sacramento Area Council of Governments for Monday, April 4th, 2022. Can you please call the roll?
Before I call the roll, just a few housekeeping announcements. Good morning. This meeting is being recorded and streamed over the internet. For members of the public viewing this meeting online, we accept and encourage public comment and have provided options that are listed at the top of this meeting agenda. For our staff and committee members attending in person today, SACOG has installed cameras in our boardroom, so you are on camera and visible to party viewing this meeting online. Be advised you are sharing a microphone today. You can speak at a normal volume and the mic will transmit the audio through Zoom. For our committee members participating online, thank you for joining us today. Please mute your devices when you are not speaking and use the raise hand feature in Zoom should you wish to comment. Directors, when I call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Bernasconi. Absent.
Here, thank you.
I'll just let the record show that she is here. Burris.
Here.
Director Ferricks. Absent.
He's here now, just showed up.
Looks like Director Ferricks is joining. Director Ferricks, please indicate your presence.
I am here.
Perfect, thank you. Stollard. Absent. Vice Chair Middleton.
Here.
Vice Chair Thomas.
Here.
And Chair Kozlowski.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Excellent, okay. If everybody will join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I will lead today. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you very much. We'll start with public communication. This is an opportunity for any member of the public to comment on items that have not been agendized already. Do we have any public comment, Mr. Clerk?
There is no public comment.
Okay, excellent. All right, then we will entertain the consent agenda. Does any director like to take anything for comment or make a motion?
Move approval.
Thomas, second.
Okay, we have a motion from Director Middleton and a second from Director Thomas. Can you please call the roll?
All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi.
Yes.
Burris.
Yes.
Frericks.
Yes.
Stollard. Absent. Vice Chair Middleton.
Yes.
Vice Chair Thomas.
Yes.
And Chair Kozlowski.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Excellent. Will you please call the next item?
We have action item number 4, approve amendment number 4 to the budget and overall work program for fiscal year 2021-2022, presented by Loretta Sue, SACOG staff.
Good morning. Give me 1 minute to start up my presentation here. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me start here. So this item is amendment number 4 to the budget and OWP for fiscal year 2021 through 2022. There's just a few highlights of the changes related to this amendment. So this amendment reflects an increase in the final allocation of the federal core planning funds of approximately $470,000, and also an increase in the Transportation Development Act, TDA, planning and administration fee of approximately $700,000. And then with this amendment, it does not require the use of $526,000 of the fund balance that was in the original adopted budget. Also, staff is projecting a net increase in fund balance of $800,000 with this amendment. And also to align the actual expenditures to budgets, staff is adjusting the revenue and expenditures of approximately $9.6 million for the current fiscal year. This amendment also includes the reallocation of staff hours between projects to reflect actual workload and anticipated utilization for the remaining fiscal year. Here's just a quick overview of the budget summary revenue. The revised total revenue for fiscal year 2021-22 is approximately 21.5 million, a decrease of 9.6 million. Federal revenue makes up about 37% of the total revenue. State revenue makes up about 29%. Local and other revenue sources about 35% of the other revenue. The main decrease, as I noted earlier, is just to adjust the revenue for future years that was included in the adopted budgets. So this is just to align the budgets to the more aligned to what the actual expenditures that were anticipated for the full fiscal year. And some of the main decreases mostly is federal is about 2.8 million. This includes the Transportation Demand Management Funds, or the TDM, approximately 2.1 million. The regional bike share pilot projects and also Connect Card is about 650,000. And the big increase of the state of 6.5 million, including the alignment and adjustment to the REAP housing program and also the Green Means Go funding. Total expenditures is approximately 20.7 million, a decrease of approximately compared to 25.87 million in fiscal year 21-22. As noted, the main decrease is related to the REAP housing program and also the Green Means Go funding, which is mainly in the past due and in consulting categories. Attachment B, Attachment C, D, and E provide a summary of revenue and expenditures included in the amendment number 4 to the fiscal year 2021-22 budget. With this amendment, SACOG budget and OWP for the fiscal year will reflect an overall total of 21.5 million, a net increase in fund balance of approximately 800,000. Staff is recommending that the PI recommended to the board to approve the amendment number 4 to the budget and OWP for fiscal year 2021-22 and authorize staff to submit all required documents to Caltrans and federal agency. This kind of highlighted the overview of all the changes in the amendment number 4. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Loretta, this is Mike Kozlowski. Could I ask you to back up to the slide previous? And I got my first cup of coffee a little later than normal this morning, so I apologize for what may be an elementary question, but the amendment, the difference between amendment 3 and 4 is a decrease.
That's correct, yes.
Pass-through costs, I mean, largely be due to pass-through and consulting costs related to Green Means Go? Green Means Go
and the REAP housing program.
Okay, so the funding we were expecting, we're not getting? I thought that
no.
we ended up with funding for those things.
We are still receiving those funding, but because when we did the original adopted budget, we included the full allocation of those amount in the budget, but some of those costs are for future years, so it's not essentially expenditures that will incur in the current fiscal year. So what we did, apologize for the confusion. Yeah, so this is just basically adjusting the revenue and expenditure down to better align with the actual expenditures for the current fiscal year. So those funds that are for future year will be incorporated in future budget years.
Terrific. Okay, thank you very much. Directors, any other questions for Ms. Sue? Okay, any public comment on this topic?
No public comment.
All right, directors, one last chance if you have any questions. Okay, well, I will entertain a motion if somebody would like to present one.
I'm happy to move the item. So yeah, I'm happy to second it.
All right, we have a motion by Director Middleton and a second by Director Frericks. Please call the roll.
Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi,
Yes.
Burris,
Yes.
Frericks,
Yes.
Stollard, absent. Vice Chair Middleton,
Yes.
Vice Chair Thomas,
Yes.
and Chair Kozlowski.
Yes, thank you.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
Please call the next item, Mr. Clerk.
Okay, we are on to action item number 5, approve draft budget and overall work program for fiscal year 2022-2023, also presented by Loretta Sue, SACOG staff.
Thank you. Just give me 1 second here. Apologies here. Okay. Okay, so this item is the draft budget and OWP for fiscal year 2022-23. It's ready for board consideration and release for public comment. The OWP defined the continuing, comprehensive, and coordinated metropolitan planning process for the 6 county Sacramento regions. The OWP established transportation, air quality, and other regional planning activities. It also served as SACOG annual blueprint for the agency use of resources for the fiscal year. The OWP is mainly funded through a combination of formula-based federal and state revenue source, supplemented by short-term discretionary and non-discretionary grants and contract funds. Staff submitted an administrative draft of the OWP to Caltrans and federal agency on March 1st, 2022, for a preliminary review of the major work elements and to ensure that SACOG planned activities are consistent with the amount and the purpose of the funding source supporting the work program. Due to the size of the document, a full draft of the OWP is available on SACOG website, and a link is included in the staff item. At the April board meeting, the board will review and release the draft budget and OWP for public comments. The OWP projects and activities include transportation, air quality, and other planning objectives that support SACOG 3 strategic goals and the SACOG 3-year work plan. Some of the projects and activities include the Mega Region Working Groups, the REI, Initiative Mobility Solutions, Mileage-Based Pricing Pilot, Next Generation Transit Initiative, the REAP Housing Program, and the Green Means Go funding. These are just some of the work activities that is included in the budget and OWP for fiscal year 2022-23. SACOG managed 2 separate budgets. The first is the operation budgets. This includes priority activities to advance the 3-year work plan. It funds a total of 57 FTE and also reflect an increase in revenue of $17.2 million. And the second budget is the board and advocacy budget. This includes technical assistance to member agency, board activities, and advocacy work. This is an overview of the budget summary. The total revenue for the fiscal year 2022-23 is $38.7 million, an increase of approximately $17.2 million compared to fiscal year 2021-22. Federal revenue makes up about 25% of the total budgets, and it reflects an increase of approximately $1.8 million. This includes the federal core planning funds of approximately $1.1 million and the stimulus funding and other federal funding of approximately $700,000. The state revenue makes up about 55% of the total budgets and reflect an increase of approximately 14.9 million. This is mainly related to ramping up the REAP housing program and also the Green Means Go of approximately 11.9 million. Local and other revenue makes up about 20% of the budgets, and it reflects an increase of 525,000. This is due to the increase in the 4 county TDA fees, and then also the use of SMF funds. For more information, please refer to the attachments included with the staff item. This includes attachment A, which show a comparison of revenue by funding source comparing to fiscal year 21-22. Attachment C is the OWP revenue by funding source. And then attachment D is the allocation of revenue by projects and activities. Total expenditures for the fiscal year is 38.7 million, an increase of 18 million comparing to last year. The past due costs and consulting costs makes up about 60% of the total budget. Again, this is mainly related to ramping up the Green Means Go program and also the REAP housing program. Staff cost is approximately 26%, an increase of approximately 1.7 million comparing to budget amendment number 4, or approximately 1.2 million comparing to the adopted budget. The budget includes funding a total of 57 headcount for the entire fiscal year, and also included one-time cost increase associated with the new MOU with the Employee Association that was approved by the board in March. This includes the market equity adjustment, one-time PTO payout, and medical subsidy payment, and then the COLA increase. These increases will be offset by saving from the future years. The indirect cost is approximately, and other costs make up about 14% of the budgets. For more information, please refer to attachment B, which is the summary of revenue and expenditures, and attachment E is expenditure by project. Also included is the attachment F, which is the indirect cost, and attachment G is the capital equipment budgets. These are also part of the SACOG operation budgets. Here is just a quick overview of the headcount for fiscal year 22-23 comparing to previous year. The headcount stay steady is around 57 with one new hire that to support the work in the REI and also the 2024 blueprint. Here's a quick overview of the fund balance as of June 30th, 2021 and projected fund balance as of June 30th, 2022 and 2023. The unassigned fund balance as of June 30th, 2021 is approximately 6.4 million with an unassigned fund balance of approximately 3.3 million. For the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2022, staff is projecting an increase of 800,000 in fund balance, which resulted in an unassigned fund balance of approximately 4.1 million. Staff is recommending assigning the surplus or the excess 800,000 of fund balance from the current fiscal year to contingency fund balance that allows the executive director to direct these funds to swap out or to pay for multi-year projects and activities. The 4.1 million does not include the 780,000 in contingency or TDA carryover. These amount of which 500,000 was committed and included in the fiscal year 2022 and 23 budget to fund ongoing projects and activities such as the 2024 blueprint, the REI and EEI work, the regional transit initiative, and the leverage road pricing studies. Staff is also recommending the use of approximately $140,000 of pre-funded pension plan to offset the increase in the unfunded pension liability payment for fiscal year 2022-23. Here's a quick overview of the board and advocacy budget, totaling approximately $1.1 million, an increase of $107,000 comparing to last year. This also includes the use of reserve funds of approximately $95,000. Staff costs for advocacy and technical assistance to member agency make up about 46% of the budgets. Board expenses approximately 8%. Advocacy work is approximately 35%, and partnership is approximately 11%. Attachment H is a summary of the draft board budgets for fiscal year 22-23. Next step. With PI recommendations, the board will review and approve the release of the draft budget and OWP for fiscal year 22-23 for public comment at the April board meeting. Based on comments received from Caltrans, federal agency, and comments received during the review period, staff will prepare a final draft budget and OWP for board adoption in May, and also submit for federal and state agency approval. This concludes the draft budget presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, directors, any questions for Ms. Sue? Loretta, thank you. That was very good. Yeah, go ahead, Wendy.
Don't have any questions, but just my goodness, the scope of work presented today, I just want to say how comprehensive it is. And it's pretty impressive, all that SACOG takes on. So just wanted to acknowledge that.
Hear, hear. Any other questions about the presentation or the material? Okay, excellent. Any public comment? Mr. Clerk.
There's no public comment.
All right, fantastic. Board members, I guess one last call for questions. Otherwise, I will compliment Loretta one more time for doing a great job of presenting this and ask for a motion to approve and send this down through the rest of the process.
Burris moves approval. Second by Middleton.
Okay, we have a motion by Director Burris and a second by Director Middleton. Will you please call the roll?
Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi?
Yes.
Burris?
Yes.
Frericks?
Yes.
Stoller? Absent. Vice Chair Middleton?
Yes.
Vice Chair Thomas?
Yes.
And Chair Kozlowski?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. We're on to information items. Will you please call the next item?
We are on to item 6, the advocacy update.
Good morning, committee members. Sabrina Bradbury here, and we have our federal lobbyists, Devin Barnhart and Jason Pavlicek. So I'm going to turn it over to them first to give the federal update, and then I'll give a really brief state update.
There we go. Hi, everyone. Just want to reintroduce ourselves really quickly. It's me, Jason and Devin. It's been a while since we've seen you all, but lots has been happening in Washington, D.C. And so happy to give you all a brief update about what's been happening. So as you all know, last year we passed the massive Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which means that there is a ton of funding that is starting to flow from the federal government for a variety of infrastructure projects. That's one big gigantic pot of money, and it's the light blue you see here, that $114 billion. That's the amount of funding that's going to flow through normal highway and transit money that we have always gotten. It's part of the surface transportation reauthorization, plus the plus up that was in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. But there's additional funding that's going to flow through the appropriations process as well. Congress just passed the Appropriations Bill, which includes this extra $27 billion for infrastructure projects. Just to give you a sense, so just to give you the total, it's 141, which will go out this year across surface transportation programs, highway, transit, rail, safety, et cetera. Give you a sense of the scope. this is where we were with the bipartisan infrastructure law. These are big, gigantic numbers. You maybe can't tell from this chart, but these are billions. And when you look at the appropriations bill on top of that, you can see like appropriations starts to look like a little bit of an afterthought compared to how much we put in the bipartisan infrastructure law. But the important part is that when you look at how it breaks down across the programs, we want to make sure that the appropriations law is continuing to fund the big important projects that we have always funded through that process. This is important because the bipartisan infrastructure law is a 5-year bill. And so we don't know what's going to happen at the end of those 5 years. We want to make sure that the baseline transportation funding is continued for all of the world of programs. And because appropriations carries most of the discretionary rail and transit grants, it can be pretty important to meeting some of our climate and other goals. And so when you look at the appropriations bill, this is the bill that just passed. This money will go out this year. This is a comparison between where we were last year in gray and where we are this year in blue. Takeaway here is that we're about the same. We made some moderate increases. All of these are important just to say that we will be continuing. If appropriations continues in this manner, it means we're going to protect the baseline. That funding that has always been there for Amtrak, for RAISE grants, which used to be called Tiger and then Build, all of that funding will continue at about the same amount. We'll know more as we get to next year's budget, which I'll touch on in a minute, but this is a good sign. Just the big, yeah.
Question, why in an environment where everything is going up, did the RAISE number go down?
RAISE went down because it's, we have a big pot of money where RAISE is in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so they really, it's best to think about it as like they added on to it for this year. They didn't give it the full billion that they normally did. It was 775 million. But so they had to make some cuts here and there, but it was pretty moderate in the grand scheme of how many discretionary dollars are going to go out the door this year. It is by far the biggest amount of RAISE money that will go out in a single year this year. So it looks like a cut, but it's, go ahead, Jason.
You know, said a different way, the baseline in prior years was zero. So we were adding $1 billion onto zero. Now we're adding 775 million onto $1 billion. So it is a net plus of a little more of about $1 billion over previous years. So it's that chart just looks at it in the scale and scope of additional money funded through the appropriation bill, which again, to be very clear, is on top of everything that was included in the infrastructure legislation.
Yeah, and the one thing to remember, there's the appropriators created RAISE. So when bipartisan infrastructure law ends, no matter what happens, they most likely will continue to fund that program. They consider it their baby. And so of all the programs, it is the most protected typically. A couple of big takeaways about the appropriations bill. One is that Congress did not touch, for the most part, any language in the bipartisan infrastructure law. This is good news because it means that the appropriators and Congress isn't going to come in every year and monkey with what was passed. If folks were hoping for changes, they might view it as a bad thing, but this means that potentially bipartisan infrastructure law will be able to weather the storm of any politics, right? So no matter who's in charge, they will keep that agreement in place. That is the hope, and this is the fact that it happened this year is a good sign that we will continue to see that. The other big thing is that they're going to continue to fund the same programs they have been funding. They didn't make drastic changes. They did do two slight changes. One, they started to fund a new program called Thriving Communities, which we're really excited about. The details of that program they didn't go into the weeds on that program, but it's the kind of program we would like to see for Green Means Go. It covers a lot of environment, housing, transportation, land use. How are we dealing with that planning? And so that funding, it's new funding that they're starting to deal with the planning of the intersection of those issues. So we're excited to see that. And then every year Congress puts in these highway and transit, I call them slush pots. They're sometimes called plus-up pots. They're whatever is the members are really interested in those years. In the past, they've funded things like zero emission buses. There's always a gigantic plus up for bridges in that pot. And this year they just made some tweaks to the programs they funded. But the biggest place they put the bulk of the money was into bridge rehab. So that continues to be a big priority for members. Even though it got gargantuan amounts of funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law, they're still really honed in on that. And then the last thing, this is a big change. We saw over $1 billion worth of earmarks across programs. These earmarks were included rail, transit, highway, and then also within the HUD accounts, the housing accounts. Those earmarks were there were a couple of really big outliers for some of the retiring senior appropriators that were leaving, but the bulk of the earmarks were in the couple $1 million range. And so we anticipate they are prepping the earmark process again this year. We anticipate that those will continue. Jason, anything you want to add on earmarks?
No.
Earmarks are hard, but Congress is back in the earmark game, and so we'll see how that shakes out if things switch.
The
in
one thing
Congress.
that actually, that's not true. I lied to you, Devin. The one thing that I will mention is that previously last year for an earmark to be included, it had to be included in the region's tip. This year, at least the House is running by rule, and I believe the Senate as well, is that it is not a requirement that a project be in the tip, but they have to get a letter effectively from you, SACOG, saying that if Acmeville, California were to get a project to do sidewalks, that project would be added to the tip if it was funded. So it's something for the COG to recognize that its role in that process may change a little bit this year as other municipal governments look for earmarks in FY 23.
And for the uninitiated, what is TIP?
The Transportation Improvement Plan. It's the 4-year menu of federal funding projects that you as a region organize and agree to every year.
Your short-term delivery plan. Thank you very much.
All right, so that was everything that was happening this year for funding. The second we got done with this year's funding, we of course immediately pivoted to next year's funding, and that process kicks off with the president's budget request. The budget request is just that. It's the president's priorities. It doesn't mean Congress has to listen to them, and frequently they don't. But of note, this chart might look awfully familiar because it looks exactly like last year's budget with $1 billion extra in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That was a baked-in increase, but the president sent over a very similar sized budget, almost down to the dollar. So we don't expect wild shifts. I'm going to go into some of the details about what the president is recommending, but it's essentially pretty close to what we've seen before. Here is what we passed this year versus what the president has requested. Approximately the same, except for we see some increases for Amtrak and some increases for transit. Neither of these are surprising, given the administration's focus on climate, equity, increasing multimodal access. So no big surprises there. A couple of takeaways though, you'll see that bridge number over on the right looks like the president zeroed out. The president did a couple of things. One, they didn't include any earmarks. This is also not entirely surprising. So they had there are no earmarks written into the president's budget. There's also none of those slush pots that we talked about before. That's where that bridge money, they were getting this extra bridge money was coming into that slush pot. President eliminated both of those in his budget. That allowed him to add the increases for rail, transit, and multimodal without shifting the total top line number. And then just a couple of other quick programs to flag. The budget included Thriving Communities again, but at $100 million, which is a big increase. We're going to be working with them on this program and working on some details. Also, zero emission planning. This is for anyone that's looking to implement zero emission technology, mostly in the transit space through bringing new buses online. A lot of planning, folks need help with planning, figure out where you put all your chargers, all that kind of stuff. So there's new money for that. Same with climate resilience and smart mobility. These are pretty small programs, but they're all priorities for this administration. And really just this budget really just continues to highlight on the same themes that they've been hitting, which is that they really want to address climate, equity, and safety. Across the board, you see these themes continuing to show up, and the changes in the budget reflect these priorities.
Devin, can you back up one slide and just, again, for the uninitiated, let us know what CRISI and CIP?
Oh, sure. So I'll just run through all of these. RAISE is obviously the multimodal pot. Amtrak funding is both and Northeast Corridor and long distance. CRISI is the rail safety pot. This is the big tent that can fund everything from like PTC to new access at ports. CIG is the transit construction pot. And then bridges is just rehab and maintenance of our bridges.
Hey, Devin, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to, for the board members, I just want to further connect the CRISI pot is something the Capital Quarter is now going after the third track project to Roseville. And actually we spent a lot of time trying to get CTC to put some promise some ITIP funds, which are state transportation interregional funds, towards that project so they could leverage it for federal CRISI money. So for Director Bernasconi, particularly from Roseville, obviously a critical project for our mega region, but interesting too that California loves to be the last money in because there were no big national federal competitive pots. And one of the lessons I think we're learning is we've got to put some money down to go leverage the federal rather than we were the last game in town. Now we've got to put money down, which was sort of against the CTC rules. So CRISI is that. CIG are things like expanding the transit capital projects, right? So it's any kind of light rail extension, any kind of bus rapid transit. It has been for a while, it was the streetcar project, which is the light rail extension now over to West Sacramento. There has been talk of extensions of light rail, but also bus rapid transit. So CIG has a very specific meaning, and that's been around for a long time. But the plus ups are huge, which means we have to get our kind of regional game together to go after things like CIG, which are largely led by our transit agencies, but will require the whole region to get that.
Thank you for that clarification. And then Devin, could you go back to your next slide? And could you just expand on the zero emission planning thing one more time, or back over that one more time?
Yeah.
How do you see that coming out, through which program, and generalize the timing of it?
This program it looks new, but they've actually funded it in the past in Appropriations. It was actually included in the slush pots for transit. What they typically do is they will fund any sort of like assistance folks need on the front end to help them do their implementation planning for if they're buying a new fleet of buses, if you have a mixed fleet, if you're looking at battery electric, if you're looking at hydrogen, sort of it's that first initial phase to help people be successful when they apply for LONO or for any of the other grants.
Is it specific to transit agencies though, or could it be a municipality that wanted to comprehensively plan for, say, electric charging stations?
It has in the past been explicit as part of the transit process. It's baked into LONO. Jason, I don't know. Can you think of a pot where municipalities access planning money?
Transit grant program too. We're going through a bunch of acronyms.
Yeah.
But that is something for low emission, no emission buses.
Okay.
So that's a grant program.
So I'm just trying to, make the bridge to the public use, or the private use of charging and infrastructure. If this is a subsidy that could kind of bridge that connection.
If you're doing bus planning, this would be like an interesting program. If you're doing general EV planning, so for all types of vehicles to access, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law has a formula funding for states for EV charging infrastructure, and then a competitive grant program. It's not out the door yet. Jason will flag it in just a second. But that's another pot that folks can access if they're trying to do sort of more generalized EV planning.
Okay, thank you very much. I have proposed that we maybe take a stab at regionally planning for electric infrastructure at least, which would kind of answer a bunch of questions about over-the-road trucks and private vehicles and stuff like that. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
To Devin's point, there will be money coming for that. It's directed to the states, but I think there will be opportunity to do that at a regional level as well, whether the money comes from the states or the feds directly. There is a federal process right now where they've released some rules that we'll send to the team there that looks at sort of to your point, planning for a more electric future. And they're just sort of very much in early phases at the federal level. So I think we're probably ahead of the game as usual.
Thank you. Please carry on.
So, yeah, with that, so it looks like, just looking at the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, IIJA, any one of the 45 titles that it's been given, we are, getting the money out the door is a priority of the administration. So far, we have seen 3 of the larger, actually technically 6 of the larger programs get what's called a Notice of Funding Availability, a NOFA. It's basically an announcement to submit grant requests to DOT. We've seen it early on in January with RAISE. That was announced in end of January, and those are due April 24th. More recently, DOT put together 3 programs: the Infra Program, which is freight focused, really mega projects, which are supposed to be for large capital projects, generally, over 100 million. Half of it goes to over 500 million, and then rural capital projects. And you notice they sort of group the 3 of them together, basically asking projects submitters to put forth a project request and let them sort of figure out from which pot to fund a project. These are all 3 really capital intensive. And then the bus facility program and low-no program, which is for low emission vehicles, really specifically actually targeted to transit agencies. That was released as well a few weeks ago and due May 31st. So you see these tranches. What we expect is that DOT is going to, I think, sort of look at this grouping of programs and begin to submit more projects or more notices of funding availability and a coordinated notice. So, for example, there are a handful of research programs like the Smart Cities program, the ATC MTD program. We would expect those notices to be grouped together. So in lieu of having 42 different project competitions, they'll have closer to 7 or 8. And we expect right now, those 3 programs are noticed. I think we will begin to see a second tranche of programs be announced later in April and May. And that includes everything from Safe Streets for All, which is sort of an enhanced active transportation program, Vision Zero program, clean school buses, reconnecting communities. And then, as I mentioned, we also expect in the summer, the 3rd quarter, the congestion relief program, Smart Cities program, as well as a handful of other programs, including EV charging, where again, you all actually could submit for planning money. So we are in the process of certainly getting these dollars out the door. Like I said, we've got a large tranche of it sort of pending right now. And I think that second tranche will come April, May, and June of this year. And then the awards will begin to be announced later this summer. In terms of a policy and a sort of more of a formulaic perspective, Devin, you can move the next slide, please. I think we have one more. No, we do not. Okay, so in terms of a formula, here it is, a formulaic and policy process, we are beginning to see DOT come out with more forward-thinking guidance as a result of the bill. As we mentioned when we described the legislation, there weren't a whole lot of major policy shifts in the bill itself. They handled addressing policy priorities by creating funding pots. That being said, we do expect to see the regional carbon reduction program, which is suballocated. We expect to see some guidance this summer on that. And we also anticipate guidance that ties land use planning and housing. Those are a couple of notices that we are anticipating. And once they come out, we'll certainly, I'm sure, have some thoughts and comments we'll want to submit to federal highways in advance of that. So that's way more time than I think we intended to spend. Sorry about that, Sabrina. But that's sort of where we're at right now in the world of DC.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'm really good at stretching things out too, so it's okay. Directors, any questions about any of this? It's a rich area for discussion potentially.
Sure, Kozlowski, I was going to put this under other matters. We talked about it this morning, but let me just say it now, given that we have this slide on the screen. This is a good problem to have. I'm delighted we have this problem, which is tons of opportunity, lots of grants, a lot of our local agencies and now cities and counties eligible for more money than we've ever seen in transportation. However, there is no requirement for coordination. There's no requirement for being strategic. And we're trying to figure out, as SACOG, I just want to sort of tease this, and this will be a recurring theme. How do we actually put our best projects forward? How do we coordinate? How do we know what we're all doing as a whole? So one of the ideas I just want to throw out there is that we are looking at having Devin and Jason, since they are deep transportation experts, offer some time up to our partners, our jurisdictions, our transit agencies, that they would actually have a one-on-one ability to talk about their potential grant applications. We're probably too late for RAISE, but all the other ones you see here on the screen. So, hey, I've got this concept, it's on our books, we've got a little bit of local match, what do you think? And for our consultants here to basically do a little bit of a one-on-one coaching, and then we can also try to begin to be a little bit more coordinated, right? About knowing what we've got in the hopper and putting our best projects forward and being coordinated. So stay tuned for dates and more information. I just want to, while we have that on the screen, offer that up.
Very good. And we have one other aspect to this, and that was the reason for my aside with Eric here, is that the funding is a 5-year program from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. So this these will be seasonal applications that will come up for the next several years, each springtime. So getting good at it quickly is important. Yeah. So we'll have 3 more cracks at this at least.
Yeah, and James, just to echo your point quickly, there is no requirement for strategizing and for working together, but all of the agencies and all of the materials they put out, the White House materials, that is what they're asking folks to do. Be strategic, come together, try to get your priorities in line so that you don't get sort of caught up just doing one thing or caught up doing everything and sort of not accomplishing what the region is really trying to tackle. So happy to be helpful in any way on that front.
We can maximize our regional result by working together. Excellent. All right. Directors, any other questions, comments? I know this one's just for information, but was there any public comment on this?
There's no public comment.
Okay, fantastic. All right.
Have a state update.
I just, yeah,
Yeah, no,
very quickly.
I'm coming back to you. I just wanted to see on the federal if there was any questions so we can kind of compartmentalize that a little bit. All right, hearing none, please go forward.
And it's super quick. Just as I mentioned last month, we're working to secure more funding for Green Means Go implementation to accelerate infill development in green zones. And we know there's a lot of interest from the administration in supporting and investing in infill housing, particularly as it relates to reducing VMT and greenhouse gas emissions. So we're continuing to work with CalCog and other stakeholders to put together a budget request to increase the funding for the infill infrastructure grant program to $5 billion over a multi-year period. And that's a statewide program. So we're looking to bring partners together on that ask. And we're also going to advocate for changes to the infill infrastructure grant program that will allow for more geographic fairness in how the funding is distributed across the state, and some changes to allow the funding to be used on entire corridors or areas and not need to be tied to specific development. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have on that, but that's where we're spending the bulk of our state advocacy efforts right now.
So that infrastructure funding, the idea is that it would go to the region or to individual municipalities or agencies to pay for infrastructure upgrades, or would it be something that would go to specific projects to pay the developer fees that are intended for those purposes? Because the second one would actually would, in my mind, stimulate more actual infill projects, and the other would be less likely to, directly at least.
So the idea behind this is what we're planning to use like the REAP funding for in those upfront infrastructure costs to bring down the cost of those developments. And so it'd be your sewer, your water, utility upgrades that are needed in order to catalyze that development. So it doesn't go directly to the fees and reducing those, but it will help the cities and counties bear that cost and not have to potentially pass it on to developers, because that will be, you know, money to them to pay through a separate process. The details in terms of like how the funding flows, it's currently a program within HCD, but we're looking at how do we ensure some more geographic fairness to get our fair share to our region, where currently we don't necessarily compete very well in the infill infrastructure grant program.
Okay, all right. Directors, any questions about that bit of advocacy update?
All right, thank you.
Actually, I do have, Mr. Chair, I do have a quick question for Sabrina. Just around this issue of, I mean, so appreciate that sort of comprehensive updates from on the federal side and as well as sort of the state side. I think the question I have on with regard to sort of Green Means Go is, you know, there's obviously we were successful in this last year of obtaining some dollars in the state budget for this program, and we're obviously there's sort of a proof of concept obviously that needs to happen, right? We, you know, now go into a process where we sort of put some additional, you know, have submissions come in, I think, from various local governments in the region, and then we sort of potentially put some dollars out the door. Just curious about sort of the thoughts around, you know, sort of in the strike while the iron's hot vein. You know, there are still, you know, multiple billions of dollars in surplus this year in the state budget, and conceivably in the next year's state budget as well. So at what point do we go basically asking the state legislature for additional Green Means Go dollars? My assumption is there's probably more need than what we received from the state in this last year and sort of the proof of concept process. But I do think that, so I understand that might be an option that we wait a year or so before we go back asking for some additional funds, but I'm just curious about sort of the thoughts around that. Thank you.
Sure. And James, I don't know if you want to add on to this, but in our discussions with our lobbyists, it was really just like, how do we put together a strategy that is not just making the same request that, you know, we secured funding from last year. And so the response might be, well, you received money for Green Means Go, even though it wasn't the amount of funding we know we need to catalyze this development. And so looking at the infill infrastructure grant program is a way that it's still funding Green Means Go projects, but a way to hopefully build a broader coalition for a bigger statewide ask. So James, Eric, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think you said it, Sabrina, which is we were heavily advised not to ask for the same thing twice before we've actually expended the Green Means Go dollars. The IIG Infill Infrastructure Grant Program actually was the first program that when we started Green Means Go Advocacy, remember this, Director Ferricks, the state would say, well, we already have a program that's meant for that. Well, you do, except it doesn't work for our region because it doesn't criteria, guidelines, to the extent that we have localities in our region that don't even bother applying for it. So we want to change those guidelines and change the program and then do the plus up in IIG. And we're trying to do that in partnership with some of our other regions so that we, you know, we can do it together, at least with some of our folks, our partners in Southern California. That's the idea. That's the strategy, Director Ferricks. We'll let you know when you can help.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, any other comments or questions? All right, excellent. Let's move on to our final regular item.
Okay, we're on to item 7, the draft final regional trail network and prioritization framework presented by Victoria Cacciatore, SACOG staff.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here. The items that I'm presenting to you today are part of an action request that's going to the Transportation Committee on Thursday. But given the significance of the work that we're putting forward, we wanted to make sure that it had the time to go in front of everyone. So I'm here to share the draft final regional trail network and prioritization framework for the dynamic system of interconnected trails across El Dorado, Placer, Sacramento, Sutter, Yolo, and Yuba counties. So to recap why we are looking at this as a regional agency, we're looking for the potential for connected trails that are then going to be able to support some of our other regional goals, such as decreasing vehicle miles traveled, decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. Also looking at the ways that we might be able to improve health metrics across the region, as it's been shown that with increased access to trails, you have better health outcomes. And then it's also as basic as finding the highest and best use of our resources, where if you are in this neighborhood, would you rather have the gated off abandoned rail corridor, or would you rather have this open public space that even if you don't personally use it, it's going to add value to your neighborhood? And this is one way that we find that we are going to be able to define our region through transportation and lever that transportation options to increase a quality of life. So what is in our draft final network? So we had the version that was released in December of last year, where we had a very basic outline of what we were going to present as a connections. This was partly so we could mark this moment in time and say that these are the areas where we had easy to make connections or more apparent at minimum. And also to share this version with our broader base of partners so they could tell us what parts we were overlooking. So we had public comments that were gathered from December and through early February. There was a public webinar in January that was also used as a point of input for those comments. And then we also had meetings with our non-jurisdictional partners who've been involved in this planning effort to help us identify any of those potential weaknesses and how we might be able to look at addressing those weaknesses. And then lastly, we worked one-on-one with cities and counties in our region to help resolve those comments within the best of their abilities. And I'd also like to note that any public comments we received or input from our non-jurisdictional partners, we sent those directly to local agency staff so they could apply those to any of their other planning efforts where they may see overlap. And so for our final, or our draft final network that we're bringing forward right now, I'd like to note it's not every planned trail in the region. It's also not every existing trail. We focused on highlighting the trails that are going to increase the access to destinations that were identified by local staff and partners, and or as ways to further the plans of this, or the goals of this plan. And we also looked at trails and connections that had a higher potential to cross barriers and to cross jurisdictional boundaries, since we are looking at the way for connecting communities to each other using trails. And so in this draft final that we're looking to move forward with, we have 267 miles of what Caltrans would call a Class 1 trail, what the rest of us might call a paved path. And then we also have 25 miles of informal trails where maybe paving it is not appropriate for the context, or it is serving its highest and best use in a current unpaved fashion, or maybe it's paved, but it's not wide enough to meet Caltrans specifications. So anyhow, 25 miles of those. And then when we were looking at our planned regional trail network, these are all the ones shown in green here. We have just under 400 miles of planned paved trails, and then about 170 of those informal trails. Many of those informal trails that are proposed to maybe not be paved or are increasing access within or to parks or regionally significant parks in the region. It's that at this point in time, it's not proposed to be paved, and that's why we have them grouped into informal trails. In the blue areas, or the blue lines that you'll see, you have a number of projects that they may be able to turn into a trail or a trail-like connection, but it's a little too early to tell. Some of these are complicated or sensitive projects. They're future planning areas where local staff has identified that they intend to study the potential for a separated bikeway and a road, or in the road right of way, or they've identified that there's a strong likelihood that they might be able to make a trail connection there, but they haven't examined it further. They can't say with the same level of planning that you have behind these green trails that it's going to happen. So many of these, their exact alignment is still a little up in the air, but you have these intentions where these corridors might be able to help connect our communities to each other. I mentioned that there are some areas where people are looking at the what Caltrans would call a class 4 separated bikeway. So we have them across many different counties and cities in our region, but it's any of those bike lanes within the road where you have some kind of a vertical separation or a grade separation. And maybe if you're a bit of a bike nerd, as some of us may or may not be, you've seen articles about how different road groups glued plungers to the ground to DIY a separated bike lane that would meet those standards. But that's neither here nor there. We have about 50 miles that may have the potential for those on-road connections. And then lastly, we have 7 different areas throughout the region. These were in large part identified with input from our non-jurisdictional partners of there needs to be something looked at here, whether it's about this would be a great place to dive deeper about what your potential connections could be to connect this trail over here to that trail over there, or whether there were underserved communities where their trail access was not that great. Something needs to be identified to increase access for those communities. We have 7 of those areas. They cover about 15.5 square miles. And then many of them are kind of smaller. They're in a mauve shape. And if you look at the online link, that is part of the attachments. It's also linked in the report. You can go to a web map that'll allow you to zoom in a little bit more throughout the region. Lastly, I'd like to point out that there are less than 10 miles of on-road low-stress connections. Much like we don't have every planned trail or every existing trail in this regional effort, we don't have every low stress on-road facility. They're not the focus of this plan. We're looking at how we could connect communities by trail, and that fewer than 10 miles that are noted on there are on a critical basis where there was no other possible way identified at this point in time. And those are the light pink ones. You'll see there are very few. So
Victoria, just for clarity there, you're talking about this plan is for trails that are not on-road bicycle paths.
For the most part, yes. And I think that as we talk about the achieving the network metrics, it might become a little bit clearer, but based on what we were aiming for with this, which was creating that all ages and ability network that people without really, you wouldn't have to be an experienced cyclist to enjoy these connections. So that was what our goal was in setting out for identifying the 6-county network. And then we were also looking at planned separated bikeways as they saw fit. But if you're talking about like a locally known cut through this neighborhood to get through this one trouble spot, and then you need to cut through the parking lot to maybe access this other destination through a lower stress way, we're not reflecting those types of deeply local connections.
Okay. And does this plan incorporate the existing trail network that's on the state park land along the American River?
So you'll see that the existing state park trails within or on the online map, that's part of the the underlying connection between like some of the trails that you have in El Dorado and here, and Folsom. But on the whole, they had state parks had asked that we show their planning efforts, but it was not clear about whether they actually wanted many of those as part of the regional network. So we are showing them to identify the potential for greater connections. And
your comment is exactly why I asked that question, because they oftentimes make the Heisman pose and ask for us to stop helping them in Folsom. So, thank you.
Right. So we have the attachment B that identified the performance measures that we identified last June when we started working on what is this regional trail network going to connect to, what performance measures does it need to achieve for us to know that we are moving towards the goals that we know are important, that have been identified throughout the close to 80 local and regional bicycle, pedestrian trails, general plans, all of those. How do we know whether this trail network is helping us get closer to those? So on this slide, we'll see that we had identified different measures for how you could demonstrate progress toward the all ages and abilities connections and achieving that goal area. We had set a goal for 30 miles of all ages and abilities networks that would help you bypass high stress roadways. And we have over 100 miles of all ages and abilities trail connections. For economic vitality, we wanted to connect to social gatherings centers. And then as a second part of that, access the natural assets of our region. And we did pretty well on that. I would say that we met it. We're connecting to gathering spaces across all 6 counties and also to significant parks and open spaces as well. So you'll see connections to Deer Creek Hills in Sacramento County, Feather River Parkway in Yuba County, or in Sutter County, Yuba Goldfields in Yuba County, Folsom State Recreational Area, Mahaney Regional Park in Roseville and Placer, and then also connecting to places like Plumas Street, so the downtown area in Yuba City, the upcoming Mills Crossing Civic Center in Rancho Cordova, and then also looking at the combination of trails and potential Class 4 connections that would give you the greater access to downtown and midtown Sacramento. And believe that the network that we have before you today is a regionally representative network that's going to access all of the things that were identified as important for this plan. On the slightly more challenging side, these are some of the metrics that we did well on, and I think at the end of the day could more or less say we made, but they're just more challenging, and I'll dive in there. For safety, we had wanted to have 30 miles of trail connections that would help you avoid high crash roadways. In these roadways where people biking and walking are more likely to get struck. So where we have the documented bike ped crashes was the big focus of this. Using trail corridors alone, we were only able to identify 25 miles of those parallel connections to get you off of the roadways where people get struck when they are biking or walking. However, when you pull in the study corridors, we're able to easily exceed that 30 miles. But I feel like we do need to note the distinction of having these planned trails in the regional trail network, and then the ones that need more study and may or may not be able to be delivered at the end of the day. For health, we had identified an aspirational goal of increasing access by 20%. We're able to increase access by 17% over our baseline conditions. And I think there are a couple of different factors in this. Part of it is that the needle moved on us. We updated for any trails that have been constructed in the 2 years since we did our initial analysis in 2020 to what's on the ground now in 2022 for existing longer trails. And then also we were using a more refined analysis technique for determining the health access than we were able to the last time, where if you see this this kind of zone around the trail line here, it's showing what your access is going to look like using existing network connections, as opposed to saying, you know, if there's a trail a half mile over that way, then surely you can get to that trail a half mile over that way, even though there's a river between you and that trail. So while 17% is obviously not 20%, I do know that we also have some of those study areas that are identified, and they will have the potential to bump us up a little bit, assuming that local agency staff are able to find connections that'll help increase access to those areas. That would impact an additional 30,000 residents and increase access for even more people above the 406,000 that are identified. And then lastly, we wanted to eliminate the disparity in access between people living in low-income communities in our region and people not living in the lower income communities. When we did our 2020 analysis on trail access, this was where we had the most significant disparity. If you were living in a lower income community, you're 30% less likely to have access to that longer connecting trail that's going to allow you the safer connections where you're not under threat of being hit by somebody driving really fast in their car. And we are able to reduce that to, now there's a 1% difference. And if we're really going to get into brass tacks, it's 46.3% compared to 46.9%. But, you know, rounding being what it is, it's 46% versus 47%. And let's see. And so that is the first part of what we're looking at with this action that would be going to the Transportation Committee and then hopefully to the board in April. And the second part is the prioritization framework, where we collected board input in February and Youth Leadership Academy input to refine the draft that we shared earlier that month, and then we used local agency and partner input on the metrics and questions to improve the version that's before you today in attachment C. What we have is that you'd still have it where first potential connections are being examined based on their project performance potential. So part of it is how they can move us towards the 6 goals of the network plan, and then 30% towards the different goals noted under regionalism. After they're assessed based on that potential performance, then we would work with a project sponsor, so cities or counties or whoever else is needed as part of those connections. What is the next step that is needed to move this potential connection forward? And then from there, to identify a regional plan of action where we would know related to the regional trail network, what are the steps we would need to take within the next 5 years? What would we need to do for 5 to 10 years? And then moving out from there. Based largely on the input from our local agency partners, we've recognized that a project cannot be all things to everything or to everyone. It cannot support health, environmental justice, economic vitality, all ages and ability, safety, recreation. And these are the facts of what we're dealing with, that there are few, perhaps no projects that can achieve all 6 goals, and then also all 3 parts that are noted under the regionalism metrics. So we identified different ways that you could stack your outcomes to still achieve a high ranking based on your performance potential. So these 2 different projects, theoretical projects, I assure you, would have the same ranking based on their performance potential, even though they have very different areas of strength, where they're moving the region towards either the trail network goals or whether they're moving us toward the regionalism potential. And then for when we are looking at the different steps needed to assess a project's readiness, still looking to lead with engagement. Resident support and the perceived benefit is critical, not just for delivery, but to also ensure that the network is saying what we think it has the potential to do. Like, is it actually going to be able to do that? This is especially important with any of the projects that are meant to increase access to disadvantaged community residents. Top-down planning in these communities would work against the efforts of some of our local agencies where they have started to develop better relationships with their underserved residents. We don't want to undermine that work or apply a top-down approach. And I know that this path looks glossy and easy, but we'll just take this moment to remind ourselves that if you're starting at the resident input phase, it's very likely that you have 10 to 15 years of work ahead of you before you get to the walk, scoot, and roll milestone. And so the next steps that we have are in asking the Transportation Committee to recommend to the board to adopt the network and prioritization framework in April. I think there's also some potential events in the works for in May, and then also looking to adopt a final prioritization of projects in June. And that concludes my presentation for today. If you have any questions, please let me know.
I have one question to start off, which is potentially a question for 3 or 4 years from now, but it seems to me that if you're trying to create a regional trail network that minimally utilizes on-street bike paths, that you run into a real barrier creating that network as soon as you hit the street grid of Sacramento. Because without having an existing rail corridor that's underutilized or not utilized, or a water course that is wide enough to accommodate the trail that we're talking about, you end up having to be on the street, and you end up with intersections every 1/8 of a mile if you're going east-west, and closer than that if you're going north-south. So I just, it feels like the goal of trying to get into underserved communities is going to become the absolute #1 most difficult thing to do here, and some study on that particular aspect of this might be the place to begin.
I think
It's commentary more than a question, but I just feels like that's where this whole endeavor will have its biggest challenge.
yes, and within the lower income communities that we're looking for, like what are the planned improvements that are going to increase access, many of the ones that helped us reach that 46% are study corridors that are looking at class 4 connections to increase access. Because as you noted, there are many areas of the region that are built out. If they did have creek corridors, they're very likely paved over and completely inaccessible. There is a host of challenges around using rail corridors, abandoned or otherwise, which many of our local agency staff have been working diligently on, some of them for decades. But yes, it is a challenge, and that is part of what we're looking to put forward in the solution for those study corridors. We did have I guess you could call it a requirement. There had to be some sort of connection to the trail network itself, but that was a requirement for everything that was part of the trail network. Everything had to connect to each other. So if you were having disjointed segments, those may serve some very important local needs for their transportation connections. But until they connect, they're not going to be able to realize that even stronger potential from a regional scale.
Got it. Okay. Directors, any other comments, questions, thoughts on this? Victoria, this is a tremendous undertaking and important work, and so I don't want to walk past the opportunity to compliment you on what's been done so far. It has been a many years project to get the trail system that we have in Folsom in place, and that was partially made possible because we had a huge blank canvas. And once you have a bunch of stuff on the canvas and you're working only with, barriers, basically, it becomes a lot more challenging. So I appreciate this work. It really does make a meaningful improvement to people's quality of life everywhere that they get access to these things. Okay, directors, anything else?
Mr. Chair, just one quick comment, which sort of echo the things you just said. I think this is really great work, and I think these are the types of actually improvements that a lot of residents in our communities really are interested in, and especially if there's an ability to help sort of connect the region this way as well too, I think is a really big sort of improvement in terms of quality of life. This is it's one thing in terms of quality of life too. This is also a major potential economic driver for our communities as well. I think that's really important to note. Just right now, I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and there's work up there right now with building sort of the Long Alaska Trail, which is literally a trail from Fairbanks to Seward, Alaska, over 500 miles in length. And it's because they recognize they're doing it for quality of life reasons too, but they want it as an economic driver to bring additional tourists to the state of Alaska, because there's a whole segment of the population and tourists that are interested in doing these types of things. It's also no wonder why people are so interested, obviously, like in the American River Parkway as an example too. I mean, it's just, it's quality of life, yes, but it's also, there's a lot of economic activity that goes along with this type of these types of amenities in our communities. So I'm really excited that SACOG is taking this on. Thank you.
Agree completely. Okay, well, Victoria, thank you very, very much for that presentation. I don't hear any other comments. And I guess we will just check in with our executive director to see if there's any final comments he'd like to add, or the other gentlemen.
Just delighted we got through our first hybrid meeting. Nice to see you all on the screen. We'd love to see you here in person, but I also, we understand that actually your ability to be able to Zoom in or be here in person, especially to Zoom in, sometimes actually allows you to participate. So hope it went okay on your end. Looking forward to seeing you all this Friday at the retreat and on the 21st for your full board meeting.
Fantastic. And when does this committee meet again? Is it May 2nd?
Next one is
Question mark?
May the 9th because of Headcount.
Okay, fantastic. So I will just point out that we will meet again on May 9th as the Policy and Innovation Committee. Wanted to just close the meeting by thanking the men and women of the Sacramento Police Department and all the emergency medical folks that responded to the very tragic shooting that took place here in Sacramento. And it's with a little bit of a heavy heart that we all gathered here today. And I just want to point out that our public servants that do those difficult jobs were able to take care of, stop that event, first of all, and then give some people who were less than mortally wounded a chance to survive. So thank you to those, and hopefully we don't see another event like that anytime soon. With that, I will call us to be adjourned.